Howdy folks, Dominic here. A very brief note before we begin. As you can see, this is a massive episode, a full movie-length finale to the first intermediate period. For those interested, there is an extended version of this episode available on my Patreon. It's about 10 minutes longer, and it goes into some extra details about particular rulers and records. Also, as with every new episode, there is a PDF booklet that accompanies it, and this is full of historical notes, photos, and art from my personal archive and from my research. If you like something to look at while you listen, or simply want to read along, that is available on my Patreon, link in the episode description. Now then, on with the show. Welcome to the Age of Montu. The deceased has gone up to the sky as Montu. He has gone down as the bar bird that he has caught. If Montu goes high, the deceased will go with him. Should Montu run, he will run with him. From the pyramid texts, utterances 457 and 528, recorded in the 6th dynasty, around 2300 BCE. If there is one thing that people know about ancient Egypt, it is that many of the gods, and many hieroglyphs, take the form of birds. Avian deities, or humans with bird heads, are as common as pyramids in the land of the Nile. But amid your Horuses, your Ras, and your Jehutis, or Thoths, there is another bird god who is often overlooked. His name is Montu. Montu, sometimes called Menthu or Monchu, comes from the south. He usually appears as a falcon or a human with a falcon head. It is easy to confuse him with Ra or Horus. The god's name is written with the hieroglyphs for M, N, Ch, and W, and means something like wanderer, nomad, or Bedouin. The god is often associated with the burning heat of the sun, and also with warfare, with aggression and dominance. His iconography and religion develops greatly over time, but he is a fearsome being, worthy of respect and excellent in war. Montu does not have a ton of mythology behind him, but the god is old. Early references to him can be found in the Old Kingdom, most notably the pyramid texts, where he accompanies the deceased into the sky. Sometimes the dead even become Montu, climbing up to the realm of the gods. In those passages, Montu seems to fit his characteristics of a wanderer, helping the dead to travel. Montu is not particularly famous, but he is quite cool. There's a lot of unique little features about this god. For example, Montu is most prominent within a very specific region, the region of Wawat or Thebes. All of his major temples, at least the ones that survive, are within a short distance from this ancient city. The god Montu has major cult centers at the modern cities of Armant, El Tod, Luxor or Thebes, and Medamud. You can also find him worshipped in the western desert at the settlement of Hibis in the Kaga Oasis. So his power is extremely specific to one particular region, a southern portion of the Nile Valley and a desert watering hole connected by the western roads. A fitting realm for an ancient nomad god. Given his prominence in this region, it is not surprising that one of Montu's major epithets was Menchu Neb Waset, Montu, the Lord of Thebes. And although the god is old, he first rose to royal prominence around 2000 BCE, in the later years of the 11th dynasty. At this point, a series of kings who ruled in Waset began to favor Montu as one of their patron deities, and in the civil war that gripped the country around this time, it was Montu, the Lord of Battle, who would help them achieve victory. As a result, the god Montu, who is only attested here and there during the Old Kingdom, suddenly gains great prominence and visibility. In some respects, you could classify the end of the First Intermediate period as the Age of Montu. The year was 2000. Bill Clinton was president, Sony was about to launch the PlayStation 2, and the #1 song in the USA was Smooth by Santana featuring Rob Thomas. And in just a few short months, the world would learn the... Wait, sorry, that was the wrong script. Let me try that again. The year was 2000 BCE. Egypt was divided, with two royal households competing for dominance. In the north, the House of Keti held sway, but their territory was dwindling thanks to the aggression of the southerners. The upstart House of Intef, pushing out from Waset or Thebes, had seized numerous provinces along the river and desert. Their expansion had been rapid and aggressive. Now, the southern king was dead. Intef II went to his rest after a long reign of 49 full years. Intef II and his government had achieved spectacular expansion. But they were not in charge of Egypt yet. In fact, they did not even rule half of the country. The Thebans controlled 10 provinces, the first 10 of southern Egypt. But just in the river valley, and not including the delta, there were still another 12 provinces under northern rule. Add to that the vast farmlands and countless villages of the Delta Basin, the Great Lake of the Fayum, the oases in the western desert, and the overland connections with Libya, Sinai, and Canaan. The Thebans may have conquered much, but they certainly were not dominant. The balance of power is hard to gauge today, but geographically, it was, at best, even. The conflict would have to continue before one house could emerge as the unifying force. In the south, a new monarch was responsible for that challenge. The new king of Waset inherited from his father, and like his father, his name was Ini-Itef. We call him Intef III. His Horus name, his identity as a ruler and a living incarnation of the falcon god, was quite an elaborate one. Intef III called himself the Cheru Neket Neb-Tep Nefer, which translates roughly as the Horus, victorious one, possessor of a perfect beginning. It's quite a grandiose name, and one that promised great things for the new ruler. Clearly, Intef III intended to hit the ground running and continue his father's successes. The transition from one reign to the next was orderly, and we actually learn about it from one of Intef's officials. Last time, I introduced the overseer of the treasury, a man named Chechi. Chechi served Intef II, taking care of his wealth, his secret storehouses, and even his personal business. He was kind of the king's accountant or banker, responsible for his wealth and keeping everything in order. Chechi also served Intef III, and he recorded his duties on a stone stela, which is now in the British Museum. On that stela, Chechi said, quote, "The Horus Wach-Ankh, the king of southern and northern Egypt, the son of Ra, Intef II, departed in peace to his horizon. Then his son assumed his place, the Horus Nakht-Neb-Tep-Nefer, the king of southern and northern Egypt, the son of Ra, Intef III, born of Neferu, who lives forever like Ra. I followed him to all of his beautiful places. I spent my entire lifetime on earth as the king's personal chamberlain." End quote. Chechi gives us a sense of a smooth transition, an orderly passing of power. The new king took up his throne, kept the same officials in office, and the government ticked along. It's a nice definitive marker of the transition. In fact, on the stela itself, you can see the switch from one reign to the other loud and clear. On the 12th line of hieroglyphs, there are the titles and names of Intef II, including his cartouche. Then, on the 13th line, the titles of Intef III begin. It is one of the rare moments where a regime change is recorded so crisply and definitively. So we owe Chechi gratitude for his dedication to accuracy. Perhaps that is fitting for a man who was the king's personal accountant or banker. Chechi dotted the reeds, crossed the bread loaves, and kept everything in order. He was nothing if not meticulous. Anyway, Intef II had reigned a long time, 5 full decades on the throne. As a result, his son, Intef the Victorious, was probably mature, even elderly, by the time he inherited power. Unfortunately, this meant that Intef III did not match his father's accomplishments. In fact, he didn't even come close. The Turin Papyrus, written around 1300 BCE, credits Intef III with just 8 years of rule. So he probably completed 8 years and then died in his 9th. So the new ruler lasted less than a decade on the throne of the south. As a result, there's not much to say about this king. A couple of his followers and officials, men like Chechi, mention the ruler in their biographies, but in terms of events, there's really nothing known, which might actually tell us something in itself. Intef's short reign could have been relatively peaceful. After the violence of Intef II's rule and his multiple northern raids, Intef III might have been less aggressive by comparison. Perhaps he was too old when he took power. Perhaps the north was still too strong. Or perhaps he was content with what he had. All of that is speculative, but the surviving texts do not mention any conflicts or wars. Perhaps a truce had settled over the Nile Valley. Perhaps there was peace in Intef's time. One record I quite like comes from a servant or follower of the king. His name was Megegi, and he was part of Intef's entourage. Like many of his contemporaries, Megegi left a stela describing his life and service in the court. But compared to his contemporaries, who like to boast of their governance, their worship, their prowess, Megegi has a more leisurely take on life. Megegi said, quote, "An offering that the king gives, and Osiris, and Khenti Imentiu, for the revered follower Megegi. I spent a period of years in the time of the Horus Neket Nebtep Nefer, that is, Intef III. I made his heart walk every day with everything that his Ka spirit loved. I was one who loved perfection or beauty, who hated evil, who spent the day according to its path. I did not remove any time from the day. I did not waste any good hour." End quote. Megegi paints a picture of relaxation in the court and time of Intef III. It sounds like a nice life. No fuss, no conflict. We don't know how close Megegi was to the king. He just calls himself the follower, or Shemsu, which would make him one of the followers of Horus, the Shemsu Hor, which may be familiar to those of you who play Total War Pharaoh. This title, Shemsu, generally means somebody part of the court or the royal entourage. It's not necessarily a political or official title, but just someone in that society. So perhaps Megegi's peace and plenty shtick tells us something about the wider period. Perhaps the war had quietened down for a few years. Again, pure speculation, but wouldn't it be nice if the southerners and northerners were getting along? Intef III might be poorly attested, but his family is not. The king had a partner or consort named Each, which means moon. She was not the queen. None of the surviving inscriptions that reference Ea call her the king's wife or Chemet Nesut. Instead, she may have been a secondary wife or a lover, a sort of concubine, if you will. There was also a daughter named Neferu, which translates as beautiful or perfect. Neferu is noteworthy for having a partially intact tomb discovered west of the city of Waset, or Luxor. We'll visit this tomb and get to know Neferu and her mother Ea later in the story. Finally, there was a son, a young boy named Montu-Hotep. This name translates as the god Montu is satisfied or content. And without spoiling the story too much, this boy would go on to become the next ruler of the south, known today as Montu-Hotep II. We'll definitely get to know him as our story unfolds. This very brief description is all we know about Intef III's family. It kind of fits with the rest of his reign. Inscriptions and records are few, and we can only put together a couple of pieces. Still, at least we know the core of the family. Intef himself, his partner or spouse Iach, a daughter named Neferu, and a son named Montu-Hotep. If nothing else, the king did his duty for posterity and produced the next generation of his royal lineage. Intef III ruled for 8 years, then died in his 9th, so we can roughly date his reign from 2000 to 1992 BCE. When he died, he went to his grave in a cemetery on the west bank of Waset, modern Luxor, in a village that is now known as El Tarif. The tomb of Intef III is similar to his father's. It is a saf or pillar tomb with a large courtyard, a columned portico, and small chambers for the burial. Unfortunately, the monument is badly degraded, and there isn't much to say about it, architecturally or historically, which is kind of the story of Intef's reign overall. He inherited from his father, reigned briefly, and then died, leaving very little in the way of legacy. The throne passed to the next generation, and a new age began. An age of Montu. The year was 1992. The King of Pop had just released his 4th major album, Dangerous, also his best. Whitney Houston was about to release one of the all-time great pop ballads, and Nirvana were redirecting rock music with their seminal album Nevermind. Things were changing Wait, sorry, wrong script again. Ahem. The year was 1992 BCE. The King of the South, Intef III, had passed to the west, ending his 8-year reign. In the north, the rulers of the House of Keti continued to hold sway over the Nile Delta, the Fayum Lake, and much of the valley itself. Meanwhile, war slowly cooled in the region of Tawer, around the cities of Abydos and Thinis. The rival kingdoms may have been on stable, relatively peaceful terms. That would not last long. We now enter the third and final phase of the First Intermediate Period. With the death of Intef III, a new ruler comes to power in the south. His name is Montu-Hotep, or the god Montu is satisfied. It was a surprisingly appropriate name. Out of all the kings of the 11th dynasty, Montu-Hotep II is the best recorded in terms of militarism, expansion, and war. Everything we associate with the falcon deity Montu. The new king took power around 1992 BCE, give or take, and he would enjoy a remarkably long reign. According to later sources, Montu-Hotep II ruled for 51 years in total, slightly longer than his grandfather, Intef II, and making him one of the longest-lived rulers of the time. Notably, Montu-Hotep II went through several phases in his reign, and we can date those according to his name. Although the ruler is called Montu-Hotep II, his personal name, he used other titles and epithets to identify himself as a king. This is common practice with the ancient Egyptian rulers, who often used 5 names in total to identify their government and their status as a ruler of the 2 lands. Montu-Hotep followed the example of many of his predecessors and used various names to identify himself. But unlike those predecessors, the new king had a habit of changing his name. A couple of times during his long rule, Montu-Hotep would modify his royal titulary. Sometimes he would add a new name or epithet, fleshing out his royal identity. Other times he would remove an old name and replace it with something different. These name changes happened at least twice, and they are surprisingly well documented in terms of their dates. This is really helpful for the chronology, because we can date certain actions, events, and records according to the king's identity. It is not a totally secure system, as we'll see. Sometimes records are still slightly vague because the wrong sections have been lost. But overall, the general reign, deeds, and history of Montu-Hotep II are better recorded than we have seen for centuries. So Montu-Hotep's political identity crisis is actually really helpful for archaeologists and historians, and it forms the basis for the story I'm about to tell you. In the first phase of his reign, Montu-Hotep used two names to identify himself. The new king was known as Horus Sankh-Ib-Tawi, the son of Ra, Montu-Hotep. The Horus name, Sankh-Ib-Tawi, means the one who makes live the heart of the two lands. You could also translate it as the one who sustains the mind of the two lands. For the ancient Egyptians, the heart and the mind, the center of consciousness, were one and the same. So Montu-Hotep presented himself as a life-giver, one who helped to nourish the very essence of the land. This would be his identity for the first decade or so of his rule. It appears in inscriptions and monuments that come from that particular period. Again, he would change this identity as his reign unfolded. But in the first phase, he was the Horus Sankh-Ib-Tawi, a reasonably positive name and an auspicious start to the reign. The king took power around 1992 BCE, and for the first 14 years of his rule, things seem to have been relatively quiet. The surviving records do not speak of any conflicts or wars afflicting the southern kingdom or its northern rival. This may have been a continuation of the situation under Intef III, where, again, there is no surviving evidence for major military initiatives, which may sound strange, given the violence of Intef II's reign and the aggressive expansion of the Theban household. Why do the Thebans suddenly slow down? Why do we not hear about continued conflict? Obviously, we do not have a definitive answer for this. It is much harder to explain why something isn't happening than why it is. And in the absence of evidence, scholars can only speculate based on tiny fragments and references. With that in mind, here are some possibilities as to why peace had prevailed. First, there's a political and military explanation. Perhaps after their rapid expansion, the Thebans were tired and had to consolidate their gains. In the later years of Intef II, for example, we do have records of the Thebans appointing new officials at various towns throughout the south. It's possible that having sieged so much territory so quickly, they had to pause and organize that which they had taken. Conquest is not just a matter of lines on the map, and even a victorious army might be slowed down by the immediate concerns of their newly won territory. If the city has been occupied by force, then soldiers are probably needed to garrison it, and they require accommodation and fortification in order to secure that control. There are local elites who need to be pacified, encouraged, or even coerced to go along with your rule. There are the people themselves who might be more or less willing to accept a new ruling system. And then there are the resources and the borders, all of which need to be secured, tabulated, and organized. And this has to be done in a way that benefits the conqueror, but also doesn't ruffle too many feathers, that leaves the locals at least moderately accepting of the new ruling regime. Of course, there's always that element of coercion, and armies on campaign might plunder and rampage without heed or concern for the future. But for their rulers, the kings themselves, and the administrators they are appointing, there needed to be something more enduring and durable. And establishing that kind of administration was going to take time, and it probably involved a lot of negotiation with local elites and community leaders, all of whom had their own power bases and needed to be placated. In other words, while the Thebans might march into a new territory or city and say, "We're in charge now," there was still a lot of paperwork, so to speak, to be done in the background. So the sheer administrative burden of the massively expanded territory might have been its own kind of brake on the Theban expansion. If they wanted their conquests to last, they needed to organize each and every territory. And with so many territories to administer, not to mention the ongoing conflict and any other issue that might rear its head, this process could have taken years. That is one explanation for the reduced rate of conflict or southern expansion to the north. We might call it the administrative explanation. A second one is slightly more economic. During the later years of the Old Kingdom, one of the problems that afflicted Egypt was the issue of drought. A period of low inundation, lower Nile floods, seems to have affected the Nile Valley. This kind of water shortage led to stagnation in the farmland and, eventually, to periods of hunger and even famine. These shortages occurred again during the early First Intermediate period, and I described them in the second chapter of this miniseries. One thing I did note was that many of the sources that reference times of hunger or drought are quite difficult to date down to a specific decade or year. In other words, we can't say if there was a single extended drought and famine, or if there were shorter, repeated instances of this problem. That question rears its head again in the later years of Intef II and the period around 2000 BCE. Some of the inscriptions left by high-ranking individuals at this time make repeated references to drought and hunger occurring in their regions. We get texts that mention the years of the sandbanks, or Renput net Chesu, and the years of hunger, Renput Kesenut. These sources are quite difficult to date, and we can't say for certain when they were happening, but they might be recording an ongoing, repeated situation of low Nile floods and times of hunger or shortages. If that is accurate, that could easily be another explanation for the quietening down of the conflict and the slowed rate of expansion. If people are hungry, if the administrators need to focus on food, there's not much time to organize large-scale military expeditions and go forth on conquest. That explanation does have its drawbacks, though, and you can look at it from two different perspectives. On the one hand, a time of hunger might have discouraged rulers from going forth and conquering because they suddenly had to deal with issues at home. Historically, periods of food shortage tend to cause a great deal of instability in communities and even uprisings or resistance against rulers. So while a monarch of north or south might want to go conquering, they are suddenly faced with disturbances in their own territories, which need to be satiated or crushed depending on the response. So that could have distracted and discouraged further conquest. On the other hand, a time of hunger might actually stimulate conflict, as local rulers had more incentive to go raiding and stealing from their neighbors. We don't have any explicit references to this behavior, as far as I'm aware, but we do have negative references to it. Many of the biographies from the First Intermediate period will include passages where the owner says how they acquired food for their community and that they did not steal it from their neighbor or any other place. On the surface, that may just sound like your standard boasting. But the fact that they feel the need to say this, to explicitly state, "I did not acquire food by theft," surely that implies that at least somebody did. We'll probably never have confirmation of that. No ancient Egyptian was going to carve their funerary monument, their record for eternity, and proudly say, "Yes, I stole food from my neighbors and I would do it again." But yeah, with so many negative statements, so many promises that they didn't, you do have to wonder. Obviously that's tricky. We're arguing from absence, or suggesting that the negative statement implies the positive. I doubt any prosecutor would get that past the jury. But the point is, we do have these references to times of drought and periods of hunger, periods that may have lasted for years or happened repeatedly. That could have been a factor that slowed down the rates of conflict as local and royal administrators suddenly had other concerns. Finally, there is the military explanation. Since the Thebans had expanded so rapidly and so aggressively, it is possible that they had reached the limits of their manpower and resources. With such a rapid expansion seizing a huge amount of territory, perhaps the Thebans had simply reached the limit of their military resources. Every captured or occupied town would require a group of soldiers as a garrison and to patrol the borders and ensure security. But every garrison, every body of troops taken away for security, represents fewer soldiers who are available to carry on the campaign. It's a challenge that has bedeviled military commanders from the ancient world to today. From that perspective, it's possible that the Thebans simply had to slow down because they couldn't keep expanding. They needed time to replenish the ranks. The other side of the military explanation could simply be the strength of the northern forces. In the previous chapter, we saw evidence for the lords of Zauti, the city of Asyut, and the king Merikara leading a great fleet and military expedition against their southern rivals. If that attack was successful, it could very easily have halted the Theban expansion. This explanation does have the advantage of coming from the ancient texts themselves. The lords of Zauti or Asyut carved their autobiographies on the walls of their tombs, and they proudly described their aggression against the southern rivals, and they included a description of King Merikara coming south with a great fleet. So, at least on the surface level, that is a strong piece of evidence for the situation. We don't have to rely on vibes or a vague sense of the historical context. The ancients tell us that they did this. Of course, we treat all of these sources cautiously. Ancient biographies tend to exaggerate the achievements of their owners, and whenever the kings are involved, there is that ever-present element of propaganda. That is true for the northerners and for the southerners equally, and we factor that into our assessments of what was actually happening. But if you are looking for an explanation why the southerners suddenly slowed down their conquest, a massive northern counterattack is certainly plausible. So we have a few explanations for the slowing down of the Great Civil War. The southerners might have been grappling with the administrative burden of a massively expanded kingdom. A period of drought and food shortages might have renewed, putting pressure on local communities and distracting the rulers from their imperial ambitions. Finally, the military situation may simply have been unsustainable. The sheer speed of the southern expansion and the strength of the northern defenses might have left the two powers in a kind of stalemate. We don't have enough evidence to say which of these explanations is the most likely. Maybe it was a combination of these problems, or something else that we are not aware of. For now, I'll have to leave it to you to decide which explanation you think is the most likely. The upshot of all of this is that the 8 years of Intef III, and then the first 14 years of Montu-Hotep II, are surprisingly quiet in a military sense. Whatever problems or priorities were grabbing these rulers' attention, they did not seek to further expand their kingdom. Then the peace ended, and it ended rather dramatically. Our story moves ahead to 1978 BCE, the 14th year in the reign of Montu-Hotep II. Things had been quiet so far. Following the 8 years of his father, the new king seems to have been relatively peaceful, until one day he received news. In the British Museum, there is a stone stela dated to this period. It belongs to a man named Antef, the son of Ka. Antef was a mid-level official who served in the reigns of Intef II, Intef III, and Montu-Hotep II. So he probably lived between 2040 BCE and 1970 BCE, give or take. He might have lived in the region of Wawat, because that is where this stela was discovered. But in his job, Antef did a lot of travelling. Antef was a hunter, a royal pursuer of game animals who served local institutions. He describes his job on his stela, quote, "I was a hunter for my lord, the Horus Wach-Ankh, the son of Ra, Intef the Great, and for my lord, the Horus Nakht-Neb-Tep-Nefer, the son of Ra, Intef, and for my lord, the Horus Sankh-Ib-Tawi, the son of Ra, Montu-Hotep. I was a hunter for the west, for the east, and for the temples. I was a hunter for the administrators of provisions. I was a hunter for the Kenbet Council, or local court. I was one who slaughtered the bull at his watering places through the love of my masters. I was a strong man, one who knew more than the wise about the things of the living and the things of the dead. I have done this for the entire district of Wawat in the love of my masters." End quote. Antef the son of Ka was a wide-ranging individual, literally. He seems to have travelled throughout the hinterlands to pursue animals and acquire food for his local institutions. Antef himself was proud for having served his masters, 3 kings in succession, and the local rulers of Wawat, its governors and officials. He was also proud about providing sustenance for the community. It's a nice little record, and I'm rather fond of it myself. But I know what you're thinking. What does this have to do with the Civil War? What does Antef's hunting have to do with Montu-Hotep? Well, I'm glad you asked, dear listener, because right at the end of his stela, Antef includes a date and a short description of the year in which this record was carved. It says, quote, "Year 14, the setting up of this stela. The year when the ruler of Cheni rebelled." End quote. Bombshell. In year 14 of Montu-Hotep II, the city of Cheni, also known as Thinis, rebelled against its overlords. Cheni had been a problem for decades. The ruler Intef II had made repeated attacks on the community, some of which were repulsed and others faced violent counterattack. By the end of his reign, Intef II seems to have taken control of that community, or at least he claimed to have taken it. But a couple of decades later, the city was ready to fight once again. Considering this is a private monument, it does not belong to a king or even a major high-ranking official, the reference to the rebellion is quite intriguing. Presumably, the news of this rebellion was a major event within the city of Wawat. Unfortunately, Antef doesn't give us any details about the rebellion itself. He simply says that year 14 was the year when the ruler of Cheni rebelled, Renpet net Sebi Heka Cheni. The hunter does say that he carved his stela in year 14, so there's a decent chance that he made this monument just after the news had reached Wawat, but before an official response was organized. Perhaps this was the talk of the town when he was preparing his stela. We might even speculate that Antef intended to join the royal response, that he was planning to sign up and serve in the armed forces. That might explain why he included such a specific and oddly negative reference. He could have just said year 14 of Montu-Hotep, full stop, end of story. But Antef mentioned the rebellion, as if this was something significant for posterity. Presumably, he intended to come back to it and perhaps add more information to his stela, but he never did, and I haven't found any other references or monuments belonging to this individual. So instead of a nice tidy full stop, we are left with a tantalizing ellipsis. Antef's inscription is our first record of the end of the peaceful era. In year 14 of Montu-Hotep II, the wars began again. The rebellion of Cheni in year 14 of Montu-Hotep II marks a turning point in the king's military record, but not in the direction you might expect. In the circumstances, it would be perfectly reasonable for the king to gather an army, sail downriver, and attack the rebellious ruler. But the surviving records reveal something different. As far as we can tell, Montu-Hotep did summon his armed forces, and he embarked on a massive military expedition. But he didn't go north. At the Temple of Karnak, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of a stone chapel that once belonged to this king. 2 limestone blocks from the chapel include the names of Montu-Hotep, and they include a description of his military endeavors. The blocks say that Montu-Hotep, quote, devastated Wawat and established his frontier, and he imposed upon the eastern hill countries to its limits. End quote. The stone blocks from Karnak give us our first hint at the king's new conquests. Montu-Hotep did not immediately go north to attack the house of Keti. Instead, he went south to a land called Wawat. Wawat is the northern area of a region commonly known as Nubia. Today, the land of Wawat is in the far south of Egypt and part of northern Sudan. The modern border kind of runs through the area. In the centuries before Montu-Hotep, rulers of the Old Kingdom had periodically raided this territory, taking away people and cattle and bringing them back to Egypt. The Egyptian monarchs were not friendly to Wawat, and they seem to have treated it like their own personal property, to be plundered at will. Montu-Hotep continued this pattern, and long before he attacked the northern house of Keti, it was Wawat that he targeted first. The stone blocks at Karnak give a brief description of the campaign. Next, we have another record from slightly downriver at a site called Deir el-Balas. Here, archaeologists recovered a stone slab, a stela, that was decorated with hieroglyphs and recorded details of a royal military campaign. This text describes how, quote, I, the king, attached Wawat and the oasis, and the troublemakers therein, to the land of southern Egypt, with the result that my wrath was satisfied. As for the victorious army of my recruiting, its flame fell in the foreign lands, and they hastened to submit. I opened the roads that were closed, and I decapitated the desert folk, those who blocked my passage. End quote. Technically, this text does not have a name, so we can't say with 100% certainty that it belongs to Montu-Hotep II. But in the historical context, and based on the style of the hieroglyphs and the grammar of the language, this king is most likely the author of this particular text. The stela describes a campaign of victory, how the ruler, a monarch of southern Egypt, attacked and subjugated the southern hill countries, or the Chassut Resut in Egyptian. He brought northern Nubia, or Wawat, and the nearby oases, or Wechat, into his domain. This is noteworthy because if this inscription does belong to Montu-Hotep, then he seems to be the first ruler of his lineage who aggressively expands into this region, and the description of bringing these lands into southern Egypt suggests that he is not merely raiding, he is here to conquer. From the inscriptions themselves, this seems to be an aggressive campaign. The ruler describes fire falling upon his enemies, and decapitating those who stood against him. Literally, cheseki, I cut off their heads. Obviously, we have no way to be sure if that is true or not. The language of power might demand that Montu-Hotep uses this kind of violent imagery, but it is certainly possible that having defeated his enemies, he executed them in the manner that is so common in ancient Egyptian art. It also wouldn't be the only time in the first intermediate period that such terror tactics were used. Last time, I described how the lords of Zauti, or Asyut, led a campaign against their southern rivals, and they proudly boasted of spreading fire and fear amidst the local regions. Again, we treat all of these sources cautiously, but the warlords are remarkably proud and explicit about their violence and aggressiveness. This may be part of the show, part of the display of strength and victory, but we shouldn't discount the possibility that all of this truly happened. At the very least, these descriptions are a reminder not to romanticize the ancient past. Just in case we start to think there is a good side or a bad side to the First Intermediate period, Montu-Hotep brings the shades of grey, the Game of Thrones energy, and his Killer King chronicles take pride in the violence. Putting these two sources together, the Deir el-Balas inscription and the Karnak inscriptions, we have an idea of the ruler sailing upriver with his forces and attacking the communities of Wawat. They also seem to have gone to the east and west, to the hill countries between the Nile and the Red Sea, and out to the oases in the western desert. The full scope of these activities is slightly beyond our story, but for those who are interested, the Theban Desert Road Survey, a project operating out of Yale University, has put together several studies of these particular records. I'll include links in the episode description for those who would like to learn more. Anyway, the first two records for Montu-Hotep's campaign into Wawat are disappointingly brief. He mentions the places he's been and the conquests he's achieved, but he doesn't give us that much in the way of detail. That changes with the next record. Having gone south into Wawat, having marched into the eastern hill countries, and having gone west to a nearby oasis, Montu-Hotep II now returned to the Nile Valley. We know that because of an inscription left in this region, an inscription left by a local. In a region called Abisko, now in the far south of Egypt, there is a series of rock carvings, or petroglyphs. They belong to a man named Chechemau, who lived in this area, and he was not a victim of Montu-Hotep's aggression. In fact, he was an ally. On a rocky cliff at Abisko, Chechemau carved his autobiography, a remarkable text that describes his work on behalf of the Egyptian monarch, and his service in Montu-Hotep's campaigns. The text begins, quote, "The carving which Chechemau made, the year of smiting the hill country, the year of my beginning to fight during the reign of Montu-Hotep II, when the army went south. He, the king, traversed the entire land, having decided to slaughter the enemy. But when the enemy approached, the troops of Waset were in flight. It was the Nubian, Chechemau, who brought about the rally. Then the king overthrew the enemy, and he raised his sail to go further upriver." End quote. Chechemau was a soldier in the army of Montu-Hotep, and he gives us a remarkably clear and detailed description of the war. Chechemau's inscription is quite long. I have just given a small part of it here, but the warrior makes a few things clear. First of all, Chechemau was not an Egyptian, quote-unquote. He specifically calls himself the Nehesi or Nehesiyu, which is usually translated as Nubian. So Chechemau was a local from the region of Wawat. He probably lived in the area of Abisko, the place where he carved his inscriptions on the rock wall, but at the very least, we know he was from this area. He was not an invader like Montu-Hotep and his soldiers. Instead, he allied with them. I guess that would make him a collaborator. Like his contemporaries, Chechemau was proud of his achievements and not shy of boasting about his personal contributions. In one section, Chechemau claims that the Theban army, those of Waset, were beginning to retreat or rout, but Chechemau stepped forward, and through his bravery he was able to bring the soldiers back into the fight, with the result that the king achieved great victory. So Chechemau was an enthusiastic warrior, apparently skilled in combat and leadership, and able to effect change upon the battlefield. As usual, we take these kinds of biographies with a grain of salt, But regardless of any boasting or exaggeration, Chehemao's inscription is an intriguing record of the campaign, and the willingness of some locals to join up with the king. This was not the limit of Chehemao's contributions. We'll see him again a bit later in the story. For now, let's wrap up the southern campaign and look at it in the big picture. Montu-Hotep's invasion of Wawat, the eastern hill country, and the western oases might sound strange, given the ongoing civil war and the rapid expansions of his predecessors. Why would Montu-Hotep suddenly turn to the south? Wasn't that kind of the opposite direction to his goals? Well, fortunately, Montu-Hotep tells us exactly why he did this. 2 inscriptions from his reign explain the motivations behind the attack. One of Montu-Hotep's chapels in the city of Dendera includes a brief description of his southern campaign and his overall goal. It describes how Montu-Hotep was, quote, striking the eastern desert regions with the throwing stick, beating down the mountains in order to bring the hinterlands low, subjugating the Nehesiu to the status of Bach. End quote. Then, in another text, the king says, quote, they, the foreigners, took a divine oath, each one, upon his head, so that his district would pay Baku. End quote. In both of these texts, there is a distinctive word, Bak or Baku, which is a kind of tax or annual tribute that the Egyptian monarchs imposed upon their subjects and upon their victims. Apparently, Montu-Hotep went to the south, the east, and the west explicitly to bring these populations into the borders of his kingdom, to force them into submission and to ensure that they delivered tribute, wealth, to his royal household. In that sense, the southern campaign was a massive expansion of the taxable population. That's one reason for the invasion. The second one is less explicit, but it's kind of implied by the inscriptions of Chehemao. Chehemao was a Nubian, a Nehesiu, and he joined up with the military forces of Montu-Hotep II. In the circumstances, it is extremely unlikely that Chehemao was the only warrior who signed up with the king. Although his inscription is the only one that has survived, there's a pretty decent chance that many warriors from this region followed their leaders or willingly joined the army of Montu-Hotep. Chehemao does not mention the efforts of his countryfolk, but again, it's very unlikely he was the only one. With that in mind, there might be another element to Montu-Hotep's campaign. He was devastating regions and bringing the population into his tribute-paying system. At the same time, it sounds like he might have been recruiting. Unfortunately, we can only speculate on the population of Wawat or northern Nubia. The archaeological evidence suggests that these people were largely pastoral, that they made most of their living by raising livestock like cattle and goats, and moving from place to place according to the seasons in order to water and feed the animals. Further south, there were larger communities, including a significant one known today as Kerma. Unfortunately, Kerma is beyond the limits of Montu-Hotep's expansion, and thus of this story. But for those who are interested, I will put some links in the episode description, and I did explore Kerma and this region in my initial run of episodes back in 2014. I will return to Kerma one day in the future, because it's a really interesting archaeological site, and I want to talk about it right now, but we have to stay focused. So we'll put a pin in that for future exploration. In the meantime, the campaign of Montu-Hotep into the region of Wawat seems to be dealing with a largely pastoral livestock rearing community. That may not have been 100% of the population, but that is what the surviving archaeology suggests. Anyway, Chehemao was surely not the only Nubian or Nehesiu who joined up with Montu-Hotep. Bearing in mind the limits of archaeological evidence, we don't know how many warriors Montu-Hotep could gather, but as we'll see in just a moment, there are records from this period suggesting that a sizable portion of Montu-Hotep's army ultimately came from Wawat, so the number of recruits might have been substantial. And while the campaign itself was a massive undertaking, and seemingly going in the opposite direction from the Civil War, the expansion did pay dividends in the imperial sense. With the wealth and people of Wawat, the hill countries, and the oases at his command, Montu-Hotep now had greater resources than any of his predecessors. Perhaps even greater than the North. Interlude: River Gods at War. Before he embarked on this expedition, Montu-Hotep went to the limit of his southern kingdom. First, he visited the island of Abu, or Elephantine, the island in the Nile near the modern city of Aswan. Abu was a prominent site. Montu-Hotep's father, Intef III, had built small chapels there, as did his grandfather, Intef II. The island itself was an important frontier town, where trade routes converged, coming out of the desert or up and down the Nile. So Abu, Elephantine, was a natural stopping point, a good place to muster troops and gather supplies before heading upriver. The king came here briefly for two reasons. First, he appointed royal officials to oversee the area, and possibly to garrison it with troops. That is recorded in the inscription from Deir el-Balas, where the king, quote, placed agents in Abu. Montu-Hotep also left some rock carvings, or petroglyphs, on an island called Canosso. Here, we see the king attended and supported by major deities of the region. There are 4 of these gods, 2 on each carving. I'll describe them quickly, because they give us an insight to Montu-Hotep's religious mindset at the time. In the first image, the ruler stands between 2 deities, a male and a female. To his left, there is Satet, a southern goddess, who guards the frontier and helps the annual flood or inundation to flow. Satet's main sanctuary was the island of Abu, Elephantine, where she had enjoyed royal patronage since the very earliest dynasties. Satet was strongly connected with the star Sirius, whose annual appearance in the eastern sky would herald the coming of the inundation. So she was a nourisher and a Nile goddess from ancient days gone by. To the king's right there is Khnum. He is a creator who fashioned humanity from the mud of the Nile and nurtured the soul, or ba, of humans and of gods. So, like Satet, Khnum is connected with the Nile flood, and the Egyptians thought Khnum might have controlled that flood, using his magic at a secret place to bring forth the waters. This secret place was somewhere in the region of Abu or Elephantine, in the rocky outcroppings and cataracts that emerge from the Nile. So the first image seems to be focused on the Nile deities, Satet and Khnum, both beings associated with the inundation and the rejuvenation of the land and its people. The other carving is a bit more military. In the second petroglyph, the king stands with another god and goddess. To his right, there is Montu, the ruler's namesake, the falcon war deity of Waset. I introduced Montu at the top of this episode, so I won't repeat that here. To the left of the king, there is a goddess. Her name is Neith, or Neith. Neith is one of the elder deities, recorded on artifacts and art way back at the dawn of Egypt's royal history, and before. She has several facets, including creation, motherhood, and power over northern Egypt. But most notably, Neith is a warrior, a goddess of the bow and shield, victorious in battle, so a good ally to have in a forthcoming war. These carvings on the island of Canosso show 4 deities honoring Montu-Hotep. Why did the king commission these petroglyphs? Well, he seems to have done it as an offering for victory, a prayer that his campaign to the south would go well. A couple of things indicate that. First, there is the presence of Montu and Neith, both of whom are warriors. Also, the non-military deities, Khnum and Satet, have speeches that bless the king and wish him success. The hieroglyphs are badly weathered, but the surviving portions say things like, quote, "The utterance of Khnum, lord of the cataract, and Satet, the lady of Abu, or Elephantine. Let us reveal victory and strength for the king." Finally, the scene of Montu and Neith stands atop a symbol. Carved into the rock below the king and deities, there is a rectangular section decorated with 9 archery bows. The 9 bows, or pesjet, represent the traditional enemies of the Egyptian rulers. You'll find this image everywhere in royal art, especially in places where the king's feet are supposed to go. The 9 bows appear at the bottom of statues where the rulers rest their sandals atop their enemies' weapons. In art, the king's thrones have them at the bottom, representing their total victory. And artifacts like the footrest of King Tutankhamun have the 9 pesjet bows as a motif. Basically, it's a grandiose hieroglyph for victory over all. We see it here on Montu-Hotep's rock carving. So the king made offerings to deities that could assist him on campaign. Satet and Khnum, rulers of the Nile and the southern regions, would bless his efforts, facilitate his transportation, and sustain the life of his troops. Meanwhile, Neith and Montu, the divine warlords and fighters, would strengthen his arm and bring victory to his forces. As a mark of this goal, the whole thing was underscored, literally, with an image of the pesjet, the 9 bows defeated beneath their feet. And thanks to his offerings, these deities would surely assist him in all the wars to come. The king would be victorious in Wawat. Now, there was the matter of the north. We now begin the second phase of Montu-Hotep's reign. It is defined by a new name. Earlier, I mentioned that Montu-Hotep II has a habit of changing his identity, inserting new names into his royal titles and epithets, or removing older ones and replacing them with something different. Sometime after the 14th year of his reign, the king embarked on one of these revisions. Previously, Montu-Hotep had called himself the Horus Sankh-ib-Tawi, or the Horus who makes the heart of the 2 lands live. Apparently, that name no longer met his needs. Sometime after year 14, the name Sankh-ib-Tawi disappears from monuments. In its place, the king now calls himself the Horus Netjeri Khedjet. This translates as the Horus whose white crown is divine. The name is almost certainly significant. The white crown, or Hedjet, is usually associated with southern Egypt, a symbol of the Nile Valley and its rulers. It is contrasted with the Deshret, the red crown, which is associated with the kingship of the north, specifically the massive expanse of the Nile Delta. So, changing his name to the Horus of the divine white crown, it sounds like Montu-Hotep is doubling down on his southern identity. That might have something to do with the rebellion in Cheni, which happened before he changed his name. Perhaps, facing an uprising or loss of control in that region, Montu-Hotep sought to strengthen his credentials across the southern lands. You could also view it as a reflection of Montu-Hotep's increased power in the south, having expanded his domain deep into Wawat and the lands to east and west. Montu-Hotep was more southern than ever before. Perhaps the new name is meant to reflect that increased power and consolidation of resources. Again, speculative in the circumstances, but it's probably significant that this name change happens around this time. Beyond replacing the Horus name, the king also added a new one. His monuments now start to include a throne name, also known as the Nesut-Biti, or the King of Southern and Northern Egypt name. He called himself the Neb-Khepet-Ra, which translates as the one who possesses the steering oar of Ra. You could also translate it as the Lord of Ra's expedition. The word Khepet can have a couple of different meanings, and that ambiguity might be intentional. If the idea of calling yourself the steering oar of Ra sounds strange, it does have a potent divine symbolism. The god Ra sails across the sky every day and every night, and he does so on a great solar barge, or bark. That boat needs to be steered by a rudder or oar, and that steering oar is called the Khepet. So Montu-Hotep was explicitly connecting himself with the great creator deity, and from a religious or political sense, he could now present all of his actions as something in accordance with Ra's wishes. After all, the man who steers the boat of Ra surely knows the right direction to go. The king was playing with some powerful divine imagery. These changes to the names, the removal of Sankt-Ibtawi, the inclusion of Netjeri-Hedjet, and the addition of Nesut-Biti Neb-Khepet-Ra, help us to date events in the next part of the reign. Many of the inscriptions I am about to describe include references to these names and titles, which allows us to place certain events in the second phase of the reign, a phase that was abundant in conflict. The rebellion at Cheni in year 14 has an uncertain resolution. We do not have any explicit references to Montu-Hotep's response. But whatever the king did exactly, we can see this as the trigger point for the wars that now began in the north. On several of Montu-Hotep's monuments, and others from the same period, we start to get references to the king attacking people of the Nile Valley. He goes beyond the classic enemies, like the Nubians, and starts to strike Egyptians. Our first bit of evidence comes from a town called Emberling. This is a few kilometers south of Waset, or Thebes, and it's a prominent source of inscriptions related to the First Intermediate period. In the second part of his reign, Montu-Hotep commissioned a small chapel in the city of Emberling, and stone blocks recovered from that chapel show the king in acts of war. In one scene, we find Montu-Hotep standing in a smiting pose. The king is striding forward, using one hand to clutch the hair of an enemy who cowers before him. With the other hand, he raises high a mace or club, preparing to bring it down and strike his prisoner on the head. Just in front of the king, hieroglyphs proclaim him the Nesut-Biti Netjeri-Hedjet, the one whose white crown is divine. So we can date this particular scene and inscription to the second phase of Montu-Hotep's reign, and the scene itself is quite significant. This block, and another one from the same chapel, show Montu-Hotep executing prisoners. By itself, that's nothing remarkable. We see that all the time on royal art. But the distinctive feature is that most smiting scenes will show the ruler executing a foreigner. But this prisoner has the distinctive clothing and hairstyle of a stereotypical Egyptian. It seems that Montu-Hotep is killing somebody who lives within the two lands. That prisoner is contrasted with a bunch of foreigners just behind him. Foreigners that include a Nubian called Setiu, a person of Eastern or Asiatic descent, Sechettiu, and a person of Libyan descent, Chechenui. And above the scene, hieroglyphs describe the king, quote, subduing the chiefs of the two lands, setting in order southern and northern Egypt, the foreign countries, the two riverbanks, the 9 bows, and the towns. End quote. Now, an image like this is not pure history. The ancient Egyptian rulers constructed these kind of scenes to display certain ideological concepts the supremacy of the ruler, the maintenance of order, and the demonstration of strength and victory, befitting a divine monarch. But in these scenes, there are usually details that give information about the wider historical context and what the king wants his audience to understand. In this context, Montu-Hotep is clearly demonstrating his aggression and supremacy against different peoples and groups. That includes people that we know he attacked on a military campaign. The scene includes Nubians and Easterners, both of whom are referenced in the king's southern endeavor. He also includes Westerners, so-called Libyans, who might be found on the desert roads and in the oases to the west of the Nile Valley. Finally, there is the Egyptian himself, who could be a person of southern Egypt, say in the region of Cheni, or perhaps even a northerner, somebody fighting against the king of the south. Again, none of that is a straightforward historical record. It is all wrapped up in religious and military ideology, and it communicates a certain propaganda. But, looking at the details, it is clear that Montu-Hotep had aggressive ambitions against the peoples surrounding his land. He intended to be a monarch who ruled the 4 cardinal directions. And if that required executing Egyptians of the north, well, the king was willing to do that. Our next record comes from further downriver, at a place called Dendera. Dendera is famous as the cult center for the great goddess Hathor, lady of music, motherhood, physical pleasures, and a fearsome killer when necessary. Montu-Hotep built another small chapel in the city of Dendera, fragments of which survive and have been recovered by archaeologists. This chapel is quite similar to the one I just described, so I won't go into too much detail, but there are some interesting tidbits in the decoration. In one scene, the king appears in another smiting pose. He is striding forward, raising a mace, and preparing to strike. But this time, he is not clutching a prisoner. Instead, the king is grasping a plant. Montu-Hotep seems to be smiting a papyrus plant. This is significant because the papyrus is usually a symbol of northern Egypt. The 2 lands of south and north have various symbols and deities associated with them in art and hieroglyphs. In terms of plants, the south has the lotus flower, while the north has the papyrus. So it appears that Montu-Hotep is attacking his northern enemies in the symbolic form of a papyrus. Reading between the lines, this seems to be a visual statement of the king's intention to conquer the northern territories. Adding to that is a motif which appears below the king. Just underneath his feet, in a separate section, we have a partial image of a scene called Semma Tawi. This is when a pair or group of gods will stand to either side of a complicated symbol that includes a papyrus plant entwined with a lotus, along with some animal organs, all bundled together. The Semma Tawi literally translates as unifying the 2 lands. So the image of Montu-Hotep smiting a papyrus plant, the symbol of the north, and standing on top of a Semma Tawi symbol, uniting the 2 lands, seems like a pretty clear declaration of his royal intent. Sometime in the second phase of his reign, the king formally decided to reunify Egypt, and he was bold enough to carve that in stone. At this point, we have to assume that the warriors and ships of the south began to prepare for military endeavors. We don't have a record of the mustering or the gathering of soldiers, but we do start to get references to the conflict that now began to unfold. Once again, I have to stress that these sources and inscriptions I'm about to describe are fragmentary, and historians still debate their exact chronology and overall reconstruction. But putting things together in one tentative scenario, it seems like the War of Reunification now got underway. Our story picks up slightly to the north. We have to go downriver, past the 8th district of southern Egypt, the region called Tawer, in which you will find the cities of Abju, or Abydos, and Cheni, or Thinis. This is the area that had seen a rebellion in year 14 of the king, and we don't know how that was resolved, but the next set of sources come from further downriver. So apparently Montu-Hotep did subdue Cheni, and then continued north. At this point, we come to a region called Hatnub, and a nearby town called Deir el-Bersha. Here, a group of overlords who were loyal to the northern kingdom left tombs and inscriptions describing their duties. The most significant of these overlords, for our story, was a man named Neheri. Neheri was the overlord of this district, a region called the hair district. That is hair as in the animal, not the stuff on your head. The hair district, or Bonnet in Egyptian, is the 15th district of southern Egypt. It's quite a ways downriver from Abju and Cheni, so as our story picks up, we seem to be in the middle of things. The conflict is now moving northward, and violence is exploding. Neheri's biography is recorded in a series of inscriptions at the quarry of Hatnub, and scholars have recorded these, translated them, and studied them. Among these inscriptions, Neheri speaks of a conflict in which the soldiers of his district faced an invading army from the south. The text is in poor condition and it doesn't provide a cohesive narrative, but Neheri speaks of battle, and he describes the groups included in the southern army. Apparently, this included southerners, or Shemau, also the Medjai people from northern Nubia, another group called the Wawat people, also from northern Nubia, the Nehesi people, another type of Nubian, and even the Amu, a general term for people living in the east and north. Basically, Neheri describes an invasion from a confederacy of southern forces, including warriors from a variety of ethnic and cultural backgrounds. These soldiers came in force, and Neheri says that they were united against him. Presumably, Neheri was victorious on at least one occasion, because he lived to carve this inscription and describe the event. In another text, we even get a reference to the northern ruler. Neheri describes how, quote, "The king said to me, 'Make for yourself a fighting company, for I am with another fighting company.'" End quote. This is a brief and vague little reference, but it sounds as though the northern ruler sent a message to Neheri, telling him to muster some troops, that he could not come in person because he was fighting somewhere else. And finally, Neheri describes himself as, quote, "a man strong of fighting arm, in the forefront of the fighting company of the king, on the day of fighting." End quote. As I said, we seem to be dropped in the middle of things. A series of inscriptions carved by this overlord make repeated references to conflict, with a large-scale invasion coming from the south. This conflict must have taken place over an extended period of time, because Neheri carved several inscriptions at the quarries of Hatnub. Whether the attacks were regular, every year or so, or more intermittent, we can't say for sure. And while we don't get a cohesive narrative, we can at least pick out certain details. Apparently, the northerners were defending in force, because the king was fighting with one group and telling Neheri to muster another. That suggests there might have been conflict on several battlefields or fronts at the same time. We'll come back to that at the end of this story, because it's a significant factor in the history now unfolding. Suffice to say, Neheri, in the district of the Hair, or Bonnet, gathered his forces and defended against southern incursion. He was temporarily victorious, and repelled several attacks. So we have a record of the northern defense fighting against the southerners, who were coming with a large and surprisingly diverse army. What about the invaders themselves? What do we know about their tactics and their methods? Well, one of the generals serving Montu-Hotep gives us a clue. In the city of Waset, Thebes or Luxor, you can find a tomb that belongs to this period. It belongs to a man who served the king Montu-Hotep II. His name was Antef, and he was a military leader, an Emira Mesha, or overseer of troops. This general worked for Montu-Hotep, and his tomb on the west bank of the Nile includes elaborate murals showing his military activity. Two of these images are quite distinctive. The first image shows a siege. An army of foot soldiers goes up against a fortified town. The attacking army is a mixed group of Egyptians and Nubians. The Egyptians have their classic red-brown skin, while the Nubians are a much darker brown. The soldiers are divided into infantry, carrying shields that protect their torso, and clutching axes in one hand. The Nubians are acting as archers, and each bowman stands with a bundle of arrows placed in a quiver just before him. So far, it probably sounds like a fairly classic scene. The infantry march up to the walls and prepare to make their assault. What makes this image stand out is the mechanism by which the army is attacking. In this scene, we get our first ancient Egyptian image of a siege tower. The attacking army has brought a wooden scaffold that stands as high as the crenellated walls. It has wheels on the bottom for mobility, and it seems to be stabilized by poles that descend to the ground. The scaffolding is hollow, and men are climbing up on the inside of it. Presumably, one or multiple sides are protected by wood or perhaps leather or animal skins, and we are seeing it from the rear where the troops are clambering up. At the top, an Egyptian soldier, carrying a shield and an axe, is prepared to engage the enemy directly. This scene is totally unique for the period, and possibly unique in all of ancient Egyptian art. There are written references to siege towers in the communities of Canaan and Mesopotamia, but the ancient Egyptians don't seem to use them, so the image of a siege tower from the tomb of Antef is, so far, totally unique in the entire corpus. The fun doesn't stop there, because Antef included another mural with a distinctive and unusual motif. This time, we don't see a siege or a battle on the land. Instead, he shows us warriors on the Nile. On one of the pillars in Antef's tomb, there is a tableau with riverboats. There are 3 of them, one above the other, displayed in horizontal registers. The boats are clearly rivercraft. They do not have any masts or sails, and they are propelled entirely by rowers. At the rear of each boat, there is a man guiding the steering oar, the khepet, and one of the boats has a small wooden cabin in the stern or aft section. All of that is fairly standard and classic. What makes this interesting is that the boats also have warriors. The 3 riverboats seem to be crewed by marines. There are archers, clutching long bows and wearing their distinctive outfits, a pair of white bands that crisscross the chest. The archers are drawing their bows and firing at some unseen enemy. In another boat, we have melee warriors, carrying large shields covered with animal skins for protection. One shield, with a cowskin, even has little tufts around the edges, perhaps representing the ends of the coarse animal hair. The soldiers carry axes in one hand, and they seem to be preparing to board an enemy vessel. Again, the foe is unseen, but these infantry are right up at the front or prow of the boat, as if they are getting ready to jump. Finally, the 3rd boat includes another group of archers, including one who is stringing his bow, and 2 more who seem to be celebrating. They are raising their arrows high up above their heads, as if cheering the defeat of the enemy. Again, this image of riverboats staffed with soldiers is totally unique for the First Intermediate period. We do have images of river battles from the New Kingdom period, but at this time, around 2000 BCE, this is an unusual motif. These southern marines appear to be going to battle on the River Nile. The boats are clearly not equipped for ocean travel, so this is probably taking place somewhere in the north. It is tempting to read this image in conjunction with the siege, as if the Marines are landing their boats and then going forth to attack the walled citadel. I don't think that is what Antef intended. I think these are two separate engagements in two different locations. But the image of these Theban Marines engaging in a river battle, and perhaps preparing to storm the beaches, is totally unique for this time. The tomb of General Antef is not well known, and the images in this monument do show up in books here and there, but they are surprisingly hard to track down in a scholarly archaeological publication. For those interested, I will put a reference in the description, and I will put images on the podcast website. These scenes of the siege tower attacking a fortified town and the Marines on the Nile are so distinctive to this tomb, and they are really freaking cool. Anyway, back to the Civil War. Our last record related to this time comes from our old friend Chehemau, the Nehesiu or Nubian who was recruited by Montu-Hotep and joined with him in the attack on Wawat. Chehemau turns up again during this period, and part of his biography might describe the campaigns into the north. In the next part of his biography, Chehemau described, quote, "Going to southern Egypt in order to slaughter the enemy, with the watchmen going among them. Going forth to the lake of Sobek, or the Fayum, I was overthrowing the district. Horus, the king, was on the river, showing his strength, and causing the enemy to flee before him. Then the fleet and warriors assembled, so that it might traverse all of the districts, the entire land. Chehemau sailed northward like a lion, together with this army of the king that he had gathered. When Chehemau tasted combat, his arm was strong through what he did in the north." End quote. Again, this is one of those records that different scholars debate the chronology and significance of. But in one scenario, Chehemau might be describing the efforts to invade the northern lands. The big reference here is that he mentions going forth to the lake of Sobek. That is, he led an attack on the Fayum, that enormous lake that branches off from the Nile River in the northern half of the country. The Nubian warlord seems to have been involved in one of the northern campaigns. He might have approached the Fayum on the river, using the fleet that he mentions in the text. But it's also possible that he used one of the desert roads. In multiple chapters of this story, we saw how the southern monarchs took a very strong interest in controlling the routes that led into the eastern and western deserts. They did that partly for defense and security, but it may have paid dividends in their ultimate northward expansion. Soldiers like Chehemau, or perhaps the hunter Antef, who were used to traversing the desert and the hinterland, could easily have used the caravan routes that go between the western oases and connect to the Nile Valley in order to circumvent northern defenses and descend upon their towns. That is speculative based on the circumstances, but Chehemau definitely references attacking the Lake of Fayum. He also mentions that Horus, the king, was on the river displaying his strength. Perhaps the king came forth on his royal barge, appearing at the head of his fleet, or maybe he was engaged in river combat himself, fighting or leading the troops as they went north. Either one is possible in the circumstances, and that at some point Chehemau and his followers sailed north along with this campaign. As usual, we treat such biographies with caution, and we don't take every statement as a gospel fact. But Chehemau is pretty explicit and detailed about the places he went and the fights in which he engaged. Giving him the benefit of the doubt, it seems extremely likely that he was involved in the northern attacks led by Montu-Hotep. If that is accurate, he is probably our best resource for the final assaults on the Northern Kingdom. Speaking of the Northern Kingdom, we haven't heard much from the House of Keti recently. What was going on with them? And how did all of this eventually shake out? The Civil War came to its end around 1953 BCE. This was the 39th year in the reign of Montu-Hotep II, and it is the most plausible date for the final victory over the north. That victory happened somewhere around this time, and it happened somehow. In the end, the northern capital and the House of Keti fell to the power of the southern monarch. Amazingly, we have no idea how this happened. There are no texts describing this particular event, no artistic images that explicitly show the defeat. There is no written or archaeological reference to a siege of the northern capital. Physically and historically, we do not know how the Civil War ended. It is the most frustrating thing about the First Intermediate Period. We know so much about the people involved in these events, the larger trends taking place in their economy, their material culture, their art, and their politics. But through all of that, the defining feature of the time is the division of Egypt into multiple political regions. One of those, the Northern Kingdom, ultimately falls at the end of the Civil War, and we simply don't know how. You'll have to forgive a narrative and historical dissatisfaction, but this is simply the way it is. We do have some material that might reference the defeat in a roundabout fashion, but nothing particularly tangible. That being said, there is one possible clue. It's an archaeological detail that comes from the northern capital. The rulers of the north lived at a city that is commonly known as Herakleopolis. That's the Greek name. The ancient Egyptian is Hut-Nesut, or Estate of the King. The modern Arabic name is Inesa el-Medina. I'm going to call it Hut-Nesut just for consistency. The location of Hut-Nesut is known today. Unfortunately, there is a modern city on top of the ancient town, so archaeologists cannot excavate the settlement itself. They have, however, identified the cemetery. In a previous chapter, I described the tombs of the Hut-Nesut necropolis. They have their own distinctive architecture, and the decoration of these tombs includes beautiful murals and paintings belonging to the high officials. These tombs are decorated in a style that is quite similar to the Old Kingdom, and if you're not familiar with the finer details, they might be hard to distinguish. But Egyptological study does place them firmly in the First Intermediate Period, both in the style of art, the language of the hieroglyphs that is being used, and in the objects found within, the pottery and the artifacts and so forth. All of that comes together to give us an idea of the necropolis that developed in the northern capital. And one interesting feature of that necropolis is a period of destruction. For the past couple of decades, a Spanish archaeological team has been working in the necropolis of this region and some of the surrounding monuments. One interesting detail that was published in 2016 concerns a layer of destruction in the tombs of the First Intermediate Period. Charred and blackened mud bricks in the masonry of the tombs, and burnt artifacts and bones suggest that at some point these monuments were ransacked, violated, and destroyed. The fires seem to be man-made and intentional. The scholars can identify that because this destruction does not appear in one single area. Instead, it shows up in individual tombs separated from one another in different areas of the necropolis. If the fire had been natural or accidental, it would have started in one area and spread outward to neighboring tombs. Because the destruction is isolated in these different pockets, that suggests that somebody did it intentionally. The conclusion is still tentative, archaeological work is ongoing, and the team has not yet fully published their results. But the authors of this study did suggest a distinct possibility that the necropolis of this city has a section built during the First Intermediate period that was partially, but intentionally, destroyed. You can see where we might go with this. If the Southerners did conquer the North militarily, laying siege to the capital and eventually subduing its inhabitants, that kind of military rampage might have led to a plundering and desecration of the nearby necropolis. Alternatively, you could interpret such destruction as intentional vandalism, a way of punishing the northern officials for their resistance to the rightful monarch. Both of those interpretations are completely speculative based on the evidence we have. If you're treating the necropolis as a crime scene investigation, there is no bloody handprint or murder weapon that we can point to and say, hey, that was the Southerners. Instead, it's just a circumstantial situation. There is destruction in the necropolis around the time that we might expect that to occur. So although we have this curious scenario in the cemetery, we can't say definitively it's a result of the Southern victory. Alas, even with that, we remain completely in the dark about the mechanisms of the Southern conquest. With that in mind, it would be perfectly reasonable to ask, how do we know the Southerners even won? How do we know the Civil War actually came to an end with a victory over the North? Well, that brings us to the third and final phase of Montu-Hotep II. Around 1953 BCE, Montu-Hotep was in the 39th year of his rule, and as far as we can tell, he had now achieved his victory over the North. Montu-Hotep celebrated this with another change of his names. Initially, the king had called himself the Horus Sanq-Ib-Tawi. Then he changed that to Horus Netjeri-Hedjet. Now he switched to his third and final royal name. Henceforth he would be known as Horus Semma-Tawi, that is, Horus who unified the two lands. This name is pretty self-explanatory, and it's easy to see why the king would choose it. Then, on top of being the unifier, Montu-Hotep also added a fifth name to his identity. This was the name called Kher-Nebu, or Golden Horus name. It is a classic part of an Egyptian monarch's titles, one used since the Old Kingdom by some of their most famous rulers. Montu-Hotep called himself the Kher-Nebu Ka-Shuti, or the Golden Horus who is high of plumes. High of plumes, or tall of feathers, is a curious name. It's one of the epithets of the god Khnum, who is sometimes described as high of plumes among his many titles. The significance of the name is not entirely clear to me, and I haven't found any scholar who actually explored it in any detail. Perhaps it just conveys the sense that Montu-Hotep was victorious and splendid, or that he was, like Khnum, a sort of creator deity nourishing the Nile Valley. I'll leave that one as a bit of a question mark. It's a curious name, but the significance is a bit unclear. The changes to his name give us our first hint that Montu-Hotep did finally achieve a victory. By itself, that would be a pretty weak piece of evidence. You can change your name to anything without actually justifying it. Fortunately, we do have some more tangible bits of evidence. In the aftermath of the victory, we start to see changes in the government of the Southern Kingdom. Most notably, officials start to show up bearing titles that previously were not recorded. The most notable of these is Chatti, often translated as the vizier or prime minister. Before their victory over the north, the southern rulers did not appoint Chatti or viziers. Instead, their highest-ranking officials were the overseers of the treasury. But after Montu-Hotep achieves his victory, he started to appoint Chatti. The first of them is a man named Babi or Bebi, who appears on one of Montu-Hotep's temples. Another is named Dagi, and he is recorded in the same monument, but he also has his own tomb in the valley called Dir el-Bahri to the west of Waset or Luxor. Dagi and Babi seem to be two of the viziers that served Montu-Hotep. They probably served in succession. One of them was appointed, then died a few years later, and the second one took up the post. The details of that are beside the point. What's important is that the rulers before Montu-Hotep never appointed a chati or vizier. After year 39, when he became the uniter of the two lands, Montu-Hotep does start to appoint them. The appointment of a chati suggests that the southern kingdom had once again expanded massively. As the prime minister or highest-ranking government official, the chati were responsible for administration, for justice, for the organization of labor and resources on behalf of the king. When the southern kingdom was relatively small, containing only 8 provinces from Abu up to Abydos, they maybe didn't need a chati or vizier to manage all of that. But once Montu-Hotep controlled the entire kingdom, it may have become necessary to have an official with that kind of power. So the appearance of the chati or viziers in the historical record suggests that Montu-Hotep did actually conquer the north, and now had to find a way to administer it. Another official whom we hear about is a man called Antef, the son of Chefi. He shows up in the government of Montu-Hotep with an interesting position. This man was appointed to serve as the governor of the district called Naret. Naret, or Sycamore District, is the same region as the old northern capital, the place where Khut-Nesut, or Heracleopolis, is located. In other words, having taken control of the northern capital, Montu-Hotep now appointed a representative to rule it. If we need any clearer confirmation that victory had been achieved, this official is one of those records. And his biography, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, describes his rule of this region. Antef, the son of Chefi, says, quote, "For the Horus Sematawi, the uniter of the two lands, the king of southern and northern Egypt, Neb-Khepet-Ra, the son of Ra, Montu-Hotep, his true and trusted servant, overseer of the prison of the great gate, one who fills the heart of the king with joy. My lord appointed me in the district of Naret, the Sycamore district, to oversee its great tasks on behalf of the king himself. He appointed me over the treasury of the ancient time. I was the king's trusted one who entered into his heart, a knower of things, wise and clever." End quote. The biography goes on and on to describe all of the good things that Antef did for his lord, but you get the idea. Having seized control of the district of Naret, where the city of Khut-Nesut or Heracleopolis is located, Antef, the son of Chefi, now went to work securing the old capital. The biography is a little formulaic, but Antef might include some of the processes by which northern power was now secured. For example, he describes himself, quote, "keeping the commoners away from the king. I am one to whom the great ones come bowing at the gate of the palace, the ruler of those who are in the estate, the leader of officials whom the great ones greet, the one who is before the courtiers who come close to the palace, the one who reports to the king in private, one whose seat is near to him on the day of assembly, one to whom the king reveals his word, in order to be a gateway with respect to it, a true one on the day of representation." End quote. Again, we take this record with a grain of salt, but Antef, the son of Chefi, might be describing the time when Montu-Hotep appeared in person in the city of Khut-Nesut, and perhaps received the greetings, petitions, and submission of the great ones of the north, the people who lived in this region who had served the house of Keti. I don't want to read too much into this text, but Antef is quite specific about his duties, and it's not hard to imagine the newly victorious king arriving in the northern capital and receiving the supplication of the northern peoples. So we have circumstantial evidence for Montu-Hotep II imposing his government upon the north, appointing new officials to oversee these territories, and possibly appearing at the capital in order to receive submission. But in the aftermath of victory, there might be a lingering question: what to do with the defeated? In 1865, the American Civil War was drawing to its end, which presented a thorny legal problem for the rulers of the North. No, wait, I swear I'm going somewhere with this. As the Southern Confederacy collapsed and ultimately surrendered to the Union, the issue of what to do with them was a complicated legal question. From one perspective, the secession from the Union was an illegal, treasonous act, a rebellion against the legitimate authority. In that interpretation, the participants, and especially the leaders, might very well have been executed. And yet, such recriminations did not occur, and ultimately a policy of reconciliation was adopted by the Northern administration. In 1953 BCE, the newly ascended Montu-Hotep II seems to have done something similar. In the previous section, we saw Montu-Hotep's proactive policies to govern his expanded domain. Newly appointed officials, like the Chatti or viziers, could be drawn from the ranks of the southern government and given responsibility over the new northern territories. Interestingly, we also have evidence for the opposite occurring, for officials from the northern kingdom now joining Montu-Hotep. At least two men show up in the record for Montu-Hotep's government, and these guys seem to come from the north. Firstly, there is a man called Antef-Nacht, or Antef the Victorious. On a stone stela now in the Cairo Museum, this man describes how he, quote, spent a long lifetime in the house of Keti, in the royal palace, which was under my authority, end quote. At a glance, you would think that Antef-Nacht was just another northern official, one serving the house of Keti and administering their government. But at the start of his biography, this man includes the names of Horus Sema-Tawi, the king of southern and northern Egypt, Neb-Khepet-Ra, that is, Montu-Hotep II. In other words, it appears that Antef-Nacht was originally an official in the northern government, and then, after the conquest, he joined the administration of Montu-Hotep. A second man with similar circumstances is called Keti. He also has a stone stela now in the Cairo Museum, in which he records his service for the northern rulers. On his stela, Keti mentions being, quote, in the house of the northerner, Peru nu Mechti, and he says that he sealed the treasuries of the northern household. Again, on the surface, he just sounds like another northern official. But what's interesting is that this stela was discovered in Waset, or Thebes, the city of the southern rulers. It seems quite likely that he came to the southern lands after Montu-Hotep's victory. There are more of these officials, but you get the idea. Records from the last phase of Montu-Hotep's reign suggest a period of reconciliation in which high-ranking northerners, who had served the House of Keti, were permitted to enter the new royal government. These officials left one master and served a new one, and perhaps this policy of tolerance allowed peace to flourish in the two lands. As the reunification took hold, the king and his followers naturally started to commemorate their achievement. One record is quite exciting because it's relatively new. In 2014, the Ministry of Antiquities became aware of illegal looting taking place in the village at Abydos. When an archaeological team from the University of Pennsylvania came to the site, they found a chapel of Montu-Hotep II. The chapel is just north of the Grand Temple belonging to King Seti I. It is in the middle of a housing block, and archaeologists had to dig down through the street in order to reach the monument. The result was the discovery of a small chapel made of fine white limestone and decorated with images of the king and the gods. The monument can be dated to the last phase of Montu-Hotep based on the names that appear in the hieroglyphs, and it includes a couple of references which are significant for the reunification. In one passage, Montu-Hotep says, quote, "The king of southern and northern Egypt, the son of Ra, Montu-Hotep, made for the gods a chapel of white limestone, his majesty having brought the stone from a great distance. His person built the monument anew, and his majesty caused there to be made a canal for making conveyance by boat. His majesty acted through the desire that his name should exist upon the monument, being made firm and strong for eternity." End quote. The king explicitly references high-quality white limestone. This is important because, historically, the place where the Egyptians got that specific type of limestone was located in the north. The chapel is made of limestone from a quarry called Tura. This is on the east bank of the Nile, now part of modern Cairo, but it was a site for high-quality limestone dating back to the Old Kingdom. The casing stones for the Giza pyramids came from this quarry, and Montu-Hotep emphasized the great distance that he had brought this stone upriver to Abydos. On the surface, that may not sound like much, but the fact that the king is able to do this confirms physically that he now controlled the region of Memphis, so the use of this stone ties it physically to the reunification. That reunification is referenced within the monument. In one section, a prominent goddess speaks directly to the king, and she praises what has been done. The Divine Lady says, quote, "To you I have given all life and dominion, all health, all happiness. It is for you that I have united the red crown and the white crown of your father Ra, you having arisen upon the throne of Horus." End quote. The hieroglyphs here are weathered and damaged, so the text is a little bit fragmentary and not totally certain, but it seems to reference the reunification of Egypt's royal symbols, the red crown and the white crown of the north and south respectively, and it places this event within a proper divine context. Victory on the battlefield could only be achieved with the blessing of gods and goddesses. No matter what Chehemau might say, the king's triumphs were surely the result of these great beings, and the chapel at Abydos places that literally within the mouth of a goddess, who says that she has caused this reunification for the benefit of the ruler. That seems to be a theme in the post-reunification inscriptions. Another text from one of Montu-Hotep's officials gives the reunification another divine context, attributed to another powerful deity. In the last phase of Montu-Hotep's reign, one of his prominent officials was a man named Meru. Meru was the overseer of the treasury, or the overseer of sealed and secure things, and a few years after the reunification, Meru commissioned a stela dedicated to the gods of Abju, or Abydos. The stela is now in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy. It's quite a beautiful piece with an extensive text and lovely, vibrant art. Most notably, the text references the unification. Quote, "Year 46. O priests and priestesses, male and female singers, male and female musicians, the entire entourage of Abju and Tawer, it is my good name that you should remember in every festival of Abju, or Abydos, since a good beginning happened when Montu gave the two lands to the sovereign Neb-Khepet-Ra, he who lives forever." End quote. Several years after the victory, Meru looked back on what had been done, And for him, it was clear that the reunification, the supremacy achieved by Montu-Hotep II, had one specific source. This victory had come from the ruler's namesake, the god who is content as long as this king is reigning, the great falcon deity of Wawat, the lord of war himself, Montu. Within a few years of the reunification, high-ranking officials were already commemorating it and placing it in a divine context. At the more human level, there were the practical concerns of organization and perhaps demobilization. Naturally, at some point, the warriors of the king, who had served him in battles and campaigns, would start to return to their homes. We have a nice record of that from our old friend Chehemau. The biography of Chehemau, the Nubian, who joined the army of Montu-Hotep, has been a running theme throughout this story, but he has a tiny bit more to offer. At the end of his biography, Chehemau describes events later in his life, including the celebrations that he might have enjoyed after the end of campaigning. Chehemau says the following, quote, "Going on the river to the district of Wawat, and finding it standing upon the riverbank, they said to me, quote, 'They planned combat, but the opposition fell, having fled away because of Chehemau. That is how the city of Wawat speaks to me. I was coming so that the road might be pleasant. I opened the doors so that I might arrive successfully. I am a herdsman driving the cattle. I am Chehemau the victorious, the one who spanned the bow.'" End quote. Chehemau ends with a happily ever after. He comes to the city of Wawat and is celebrated there for his victory and his valor, and apparently he ended his days in pastoral tranquility. He herded the cattle and enjoyed the memory of his victories. A nice end for a man whose career had started in a context of terrible war, but ultimately he achieved great success in the army of the king. With the conclusion of Chehemau's biography, we must bring to an end our tale of the First Intermediate Period. There is so much more that I wanted to cover, so many more records, monuments, inscriptions, and artistic pieces that I desperately wanted to include. In the end, this series could have been twice as long, twice as detailed as I managed to present, but we have to stop somewhere. And at the very least, this is a substantial expansion on the original episodes I produced 10 years ago. For now, let's tie things up with one lingering question. Why exactly did the Southerners win this war? Throughout the First Intermediate Period, the division between North and South seems to have been relatively equal or stable. The Northerners were a strong and centralized kingdom, one that inherited the government system from the Old Kingdom before it, and continued to rule the majority of Egypt's geographical territory. By contrast, the Thebans had emerged from a single out-of-the-way city in the southern part of the Nile. Then they had expanded to include new territories and districts. But up until the reign of Montu-Hotep II, they still ruled less than half of the Nile Valley territory. If you're looking at things from a purely geographic sense, it's hard to explain why the Thebans were ultimately victorious. Obviously, there are many gaps in the story, and there are certain questions that we simply can never answer. But based on the material I've presented so far, there might be a couple of explanations. One factor seems to concern the south, not southern Egypt, but the lands beyond it. Once Montu-Hotep takes control of Wawat, the eastern hinterland, and the western oases, it seems like at that point his military and economic power grows substantially, to the point that the northern campaign begins to proceed far more quickly than it had in previous generations. In other words, it could be the wealth and human resources of these southern lands that ultimately enabled Montu-Hotep to get over the finish line, to tip the balance of power in the southerners' favor. We can only speculate why previous rulers, like Intef II, had not gone into the Southlands to properly consolidate and conquer them. But at the very least, the acquisition of Wawat and its incorporation into the Theban kingdom might have been the last piece of the puzzle that they needed to gain advantage. Another one is more speculative in context, but it might be a good political explanation. Throughout this story, we met a group of overlords who ruled in northern Egypt. These included the governors of Zauti, or Asyut, and also of Beni Hassan and Deir el-Bersha nearby. Notably, the families that ruled these communities seem to have carried on as powerful elites after the reunification. That stands in contrast to other regions, for example, the city of Koptos or Gebtu, where the overlords of that city disappear from the historical record after the Theban conquest. In the north, we have a small cluster of governors who did fight against the south, and yet their families continued to hold office. That continuity across the generations and in the wake of a civil war has led some scholars to speculate perhaps the lords of Zauti, of Beni Hassan and Deir el-Bersha might have switched sides late in the conflict. At some point, the rulers of these regions might have recognized they could no longer resist the onslaught of the Theban forces. Perhaps men like Bakhet III or Neheri or the governors of Zauti realized which way the winds were blowing, and they voluntarily submitted to Montu-Hotep. In that scenario, these lords might have negotiated with the southerners to ensure they would retain their political offices and their control over these regions. Again, that is speculative, but if it is accurate, it could have been a pivotal turning point. In the later years of Intef II, the lords of Zauti or Asyut are the most visible of the warlords resisting the Theban expansion. If those warlords suddenly switched sides and came to support the southerners, that might have spelled the end for the northern rulership. Like a temple pylon with its foundations undermined, the House of Keti might have rapidly collapsed once they lost their servants. Then there are the northern kings themselves. As I've mentioned before in this series, the rulers of the House of Keti are almost shadows in the historical record. Very few artifacts, and even fewer monuments, testify to their existence and their activities. We have tiny scraps here and there, but we can't say anything about them as individuals or as rulers. We can only guess at their policies, largely based on stories like the Lamentations of Ipuwer or the Teaching for Merikara, both of which may have been written in later generations and which may have a degree of propaganda against the northern household. Basically, the House of Keti seems to have disappeared completely from royal history. That disappearance maybe suggests that somehow they had lost legitimacy as rulers of the north. At some point, one of their actions, policies, or deeds might have brought the House of Keti into disrepute, and coupled with military defeat, the shifting of political allegiances as loyal servants suddenly switched sides, that might have brought the entire House of Keti collapsing like the proverbial House of Cards. Again, that is totally speculative. We simply don't know enough about these rulers to say anything concrete. But a loss of legitimacy, an undermining of divine or political authority, might have brought them low much quicker than anticipated. And in the end, what remained was swept away by the new order. A broken lineage, swiftly forgotten. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. I hope you have enjoyed this return to the First Intermediate period. As I've said, there is so much more I wanted to include. I have focused almost entirely on the military record of this ruler, but there is a great deal more I could have discussed, like his grand temple at Deir el-Bahri, the burials of his queens, which are surprisingly well preserved, and some of his regional monuments that have been discovered in recent years. Unfortunately, we simply don't have time to go into those. If you are interested in that subject matter, I did cover some of them in my initial run of episodes back in 2014. You can find them in the podcast narrative around episode 27 and beyond. In the future, I would like to return to this era, at least now and again, to pick up on certain threads. I am quite fond of the First Intermediate period. It's a uniquely fascinating time in which the Egyptian political structure seems to collapse in on itself. And yet the evidence for local resilience, even prosperity, is visible and abundant. There is so much more I want to say, but for now, this is the end of this tale. Around 1953 BCE, Montu-Hotep II, the god Montu is satisfied, became the lord of southern and northern Egypt. At last, he was the Sema-Tawi, the uniter of two lands. And with his victory achieved in war, one could certainly say that Montu, Neith, Ra, Satet, Khnum, and many other deities were content with the newly established order. Peace and unity had returned to the Nile Valley. The age of discord was ended. At least for a while. Before I go, I must extend my thanks to the priests, those who ensure the operations of the temples and guarantee that all deities, both warriors, creators, and celestial sun gods, are satisfied and happy with our deeds on earth. My thanks to Arthur, James, Veronica, Ashley, Neden, Kyla, Andy and Chelsea, Mykost, Yola, TJ, Terry, Eric, and Linda. Folks, you are all too generous, and I am in your debt. May these great deities bless you and bring prosperity to all your endeavors. Just don't start conquering any territories. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed the tale, and I will see you soon. Onwards, back to the narrative.